know if I'll ever get around to posting things, but might as well try. Okay. Let me share my screen. So we were looking at tshuva. So there's really two separate, kind of, anti-reform kind of watersheds. I mean, one is, as I mentioned, in 1819, the Bezdin of Hamburg, and that's like really the first official thing to be written about it. And then, of course, there's the Psak Din in Hungary in the 1850s, 1854, I think it was. And because so this is the tshuva on the organ. And if you remember, the question was that a rabbi came to Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, and this is in the 1890s, and he says basically, people in my shul want an organ, and maybe I can bargain them down to just a weekday. If not, they're going to get rid of me, and they'll probably find a rabbi who will give them what they want. So the question is, what should he do? Okay. Just since Ken just got on, I'll just repeat the question. This is a tshuva, a responsa from the 1890s to one of the great rabbis in Germany. And it's from a rabbi who says basically, the people in my synagogue, they want an organ. They want to play the organ with davening. And he says, I can probably bargain them down to get them to not do it on Shabbos, just do it on weekdays. If I don't, they'll probably kick me out and find a rabbi who's more liberal and will let them do all of that. What should I do? So he writes back, before we, give our own answer, which is, all right, welcome, Mark. I can't remember if Mark was here last time, but basically the question here is, it's being written to a rabbi in Germany in the 1890s. It's a rabbi of an individual synagogue. He basically says, the people in my shul want an organ. If I don't give it to them, they'll probably kick me out and get a more liberal rabbi. Should I bargain them down to just having an organ on the weekday? What do you think? It's an Orthodox synagogue, obviously. He says, let's look El Mishkanot Haroim Hima Hagovrim Anshe Hashem Shekatu Psak Dinam. Now he says, let's look back to the Hamburg Bezdin. And he's writing this in the 1890s, but he says, let's look back to the Hamburg Bezdin in 1819, which is 70 years before. Because they were writing it about when the first, calls it wickedness, the first reform was beginning in Hamburg. And they were just beginning to break through many of the boundaries of religion. And the Beit Din in Hamburg in 1819 got together letters and decisions, and they published it in a book which was called Ele Divrei Habrit. These are the words of the covenant. And we looked at it yesterday. We just looked at the cover of it. And there, the great rabbis made three pronouncements to forbid things. The first one is that you're not allowed to play an instrument in the shul on Shabbat or Yom Tov, even by having a non-Jew do it. And all of the rabbis there all agreed together that you're not allowed to play an instrument on Shabbos and Yom Tov, even through a non-Jew. Everybody agreed on that. Now, again, he has to say this because in the Shulchan Aruch, it's not so clear. The idea of having a non-Jew play instruments as a matter of simcha, as a matter of joy, for, let's say, right after a wedding on Shabbat, that might be permitted. The question, though, here is, right, in other words, we've forbidden it, going back to 1819, but what about on the weekdays for using an organ? Or no, are you not allowed to do that? In other words, obviously that avoids the Shabbat issue, but it's a question of chukot hagoyim. Are you then going in the way of the non-Jew? Are you invading the non-Jew through reform? So he says, I have not seen any agreement about what the law would be on a weekday. And he says, after I've looked at it, I found 3 opinions. Now, the book that the psaktin that he's quoting, let's just go back to the language of it. And again, it's a very big book. It's 150 pages. But right on the front page, it tells you the 3 main things that they came to say. And this is the book. Ele divrei habrit. These are the words of the covenant. And it says that you're not allowed to change the Torah. Psak din sheyatz mipi beis din tzedek b'Hamburg. This is the legal decision of the court in Hamburg, of the Jewish court, and we're doing it to strengthen the rabbis in Ashkenaz, in Germany, in Poland, in Italy, in Bohemia. Kulam ke'echad onim v'omrim. All the rabbis say together, lahafer dat chadasha, that we have to undo this new religious movement that is coming out of ignorance, that's creating new customs that are not the customs of Moshe and Israel. And therefore, the rabbis, us, we call out together in one voice to make fences. Right? That's just they use that language. Makam neman, bika matzu, begidru geder. We have found a quote from somewhere. We found a valley. We found the right space, and we're making fences. Le'asor isor, to make 3 things forbidden. You're not allowed to change the order of prayers from the brachas until after Aleinu, and you can't take away from them. You can't pray in the vernacular, only in Hebrew, and you can't, make a new prayer. And Asur Nagin, you're not allowed to play instruments in the shul on Shabbat and Yom Tov, even through and having a non-Jew do it. Okay, those are the 3 things. So that's what he's referring back to. Okay. So he says, but the question of now it sounds like if the Beis Din of Hamburg 70 years before had said that you're not allowed to play an instrument on the weekday because it's too much like the non-Jew, which of course many people said, would he have just dismissed it out of hand? Right? There's a lot at stake here in this question. It's not just, can you do it? It's, if I don't do it, they're going to kick me out and get somebody who will let them. So it's not like it's going to solve the problem. But he understands that there's a real cost-benefit analysis to be made here. So he says, in terms of the organ on a weekday, I see 3 opinions among rabbis. Now, obviously, it's not an age-old question. The age-old question was, it seemed like you could have a non-Jew playing Shabbos, but it was Shema Yitakin Klishir, that you might make or fix an instrument. That was the problem. But having a non-Jew do it, if they need to fix it on their own, they can do that. There are those opinions, he says. Here's opinion number 1. Opinion number 1 is that you're not allowed to play on Shabbos and Yom Tov an instrument, but they didn't say anything about weekday. And maybe they hold that on the weekday it's permitted. Or maybe they hold that we're not sure, and they just didn't want to, therefore, give an opinion about weekday. And the Beis Din Tzedek in Hamburg, at the beginning of the book that we just looked at, Ele Divrei Habrit, Rabbi Meshulam Zalman HaKohen, Baal Big Day Kahuna, Rabbi Meshulam Zalman HaKohen, who wrote the book Big Day Kahuna, Rabbi Lezer, who wrote Shemen Rokeach, Rabbi Abraham Tickton from Breslau. Now that's a very important name, Rabbi Abraham Tickton of Breslau. I was actually just reading about him in Katz's book, House Divided. And he was in Breslau, he was basically deposed, and Abraham Geiger was put in his place, the famous reformer. That was like the beginnings of reform, and because the government, again, as I mentioned yesterday, the religion was monitored by the government, and it was actually regulated by the government. And the Jewish community was one kehillah. It collected taxes. It got money from the government. It was like a political body, and the government did not want it branching off into other religious denominations. And the government had a lot to say about this. So they wanted, basically, the government wanted a representative. And the question was who it was going to be. And Rabbi Abraham Tickton was a traditionalist, but Abraham Geiger obviously was a reformer. And a lot of the people, I guess, wanted a reformation, but also a lot of the people wanted, the Jewish community was split between Reformation and traditionalism. And just because one person was elected to be the head, like you could imagine, it came from education, money was involved, there was all kinds of stuff. It wasn't just, the people are going to all vote. It wasn't that way. So just because, Abraham Geiger was made the head of the Jewish community, the representative to the government, didn't mean that all the people had become reformers. That wasn't true. The people were not very learned. The people were traditionalists, basically. But Rabbi Abraham Tickton was the head of the Breslov community before him. And then he either died or was pushed out. Rabbi Aaron Yeshua Ravitch, Bezdin of Padua, Rabbi Yaakov Eger, and he writes that even on the weekday, it's not clear that they permitted it. Thus, Tam She'enan Mipalim B'Frishas Kapayim Madam Le'Iser Delo Takim L'Chamat Seva. Now, maybe this is just the creation of something new should be forbidden, a new way of praying. So he says we don't have them saying it's forbidden. As we just looked at, it said Shabbos and Yom Tov, didn't say weekday. But he says maybe they would forbid it because you shouldn't have a new way of praying. That's one. Number two, Yesh Me'agaonim, the second opinion is that there are those rabbis that permit it. They clearly permit using an instrument on the weekday. For instance, the Bezdin of Prague, Rabbi Lezer Felkish, Rabbi Shmuel Landau. Now you remember the Mata Levi, when we saw that tshuva, he quoted, he quoted the Rabbi of Prague, saying the Rabbi of Prague himself plays an instrument on the weekdays in the shul. Remember that? I think it was Prague. Rabbi Shmuel Landau, Rabbi Lev Malich, Kosu, Masha, Menagnim, B'Kli Shir, B'Shabbos, Kodesh, also Menagnim. They say you're not allowed to play an organ on Shabbos, even through a non-Jew. You can't play any instrument on Shabbos, even through a non-Jew in the shul. And the fact that we use instruments at Kabbalat Shabbat, he says the fact that we in Prague and in these other places, we use instruments for Kabbalat Shabbat, but we put them away half an hour before Baruch Hu. Very interesting. And he says maybe they only permitted other instruments on a weekday and not an organ, right? In other words, the issue isn't, right, you see now, the issue isn't an instrument. The issue is an organ, because that's what the reform were using. We talked about yesterday how an organ, how in this question that's asked, he says they're going to get another rabbi who will allow them to use an organ at weddings, and no, should I allow them on the weekday? Now, it doesn't mean that on weekday davening they're going to have an organ. They're not interested in an organ at Shabbos. What they're interested in is an organ at a wedding, in a wedding, ceremonial part of a wedding, or I guess in davening on the birthday of the king. That's what he says. So that's what we understood, is that an organ is not, it's not just about like, we want to be inspired music. That doesn't seem to be what it was. It seems that it was more about formality and about structure and about being noble individuals rather than schleppy Jews. That seems to be a big part of what the organ represents here. And so the idea of having it on the weekday is right. So the idea that maybe you'd be allowed to use a guitar on the weekday, but not an organ, makes a lot of sense, because organ represents something, represents reform, it represents the high church, it represents the formality of German life, of being a German, and not, sort of being a modernist. It represented modernity for these people. That's what's so interesting. It doesn't make any sense to us. It's not what resonates for us, but for them it does. 10 rabbis in Livarna who are signed on a letter in this book, they say that it's forbidden on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and we permitted it on Chol Hamoed and on Erev Shabbos and Erev Yom Tov, before Shabbat comes in. And who are we going to allow to play it on the weekday or right before Shabbos? Jews. In other words, only Jews, not non-Jews. In other words, this is not about, right? What does that mean? Why is it better to have a Jew play it on a weekday than a non-Jew? Who cares who plays it? The answer, of course, is the question of, is this being a German? You're going to have an organ player, or is this about the Levites? Is this about Jewish, inspiring your prayer? It's interesting. We all sort of think that like the idea of inspired prayer and song and dance, that it didn't start till Shlomo Carlebach. But you see here that in Prague, in the early 1800s, they were for Kabbalat Shabbat, they were playing instruments. I mean, that's very interesting. I actually used to do in St. Louis. We used to once in a while do on my shul. We would do Kabbalat Shabbat with instruments, like guitar and drum, and before Shabbos, we'd start before Shabbos, and then right after L'Chadodi, we would put them away, and then we'd start Shabbos. And it was extremely inspiring. I mean, it was really beautiful. And I got the idea, of course, to tell you the truth. So where did I get the idea? I got the idea because I used to be a Hillel rabbi, and we had a Reform, a Conservative, and Orthodox service at the Hillel. And when I would be at the Reform service and I would hear them play the guitar, it was beautiful. My wife didn't like it because she grew up Reform, but I thought it was like a great way to inspire davening. And so I brought that into the Orthodox synagogue. But of course, I'm not going to do it on Shabbos. We did it before Shabbos, precisely this, Kabbalat Shabbat, we did, and then we put it away before Shabbos, just like they did. I'd never seen this tshuva before, but obviously they were doing this in Prague 200 years ago, which is interesting. So the idea, I think part of what we have to navigate here is what's the motivation? Is the motive, you can see it sort of between the lines in the writing, is the motivation to play an organ, to be an upstanding German, and modernist like the Reformers, or is this about joy? Right, those are two very different things. Because again, the idea of having a non-Jew play instruments is not so far-fetched. I'll show you the Shulchan Aruch about it, and I think Rabbi Vajra Seifi improves it. But obviously it took on a life of its own once the Reform was emerged. Maybe at the beginning of tomorrow we'll look at Shulchan Aruch about having a non-Jew play instruments and channels. Okay.
Thank you.
Good, thank you.
Right.